The new book a plug, that would be great as well.
Will do. We're live now. Well, hello and welcome to this special edition of the Macquarie Street Political Podcast. I'm Lyle Shelton. It's fantastic to have Dr. Kevin Donnelly with me as my guest today. Kevin is one of Australia's leading conservative public intellectuals and culture warriors. Since first warning about the dangers of political correctness way back in 1992, Kevin has engaged in the battle of ideas against the cultural left's long march through the institutions. His latest book is Christianity is Good for You, Why Faith Matters. Kevin, welcome to the Macquarie Street Political Podcast.
Always a pleasure, Lyle. Thank you for having me on the podcast.
So grateful for your time today, Kevin. Christianity is Good for You. That's a very provocative title for a book these days. There's a lot of hostility towards Christianity, towards Christians who dare to put their heads up in the public square. Why such an in-your-face title for this latest of your books?
Well, Lyle, like you, I'm a Christian, I'm a conservative, and for many years now, I've been following debates about what is now called cancel culture or being woke. But when I was at university many years ago, I did postgraduate and in education. I was always a very strong supporter of a liberal view of education, which has very strong Christian underpinnings. Now, whether it's Cardinal Newman or Aquinas, or whether it's the idea of the original universities in England and, say, Sydney and Melbourne, where there was a strong Christian element underpinning that. What happened was when I did the postgrad work, I also discovered that there was a movement, a very secular, radical movement to undermine Christianity in education. And that goes back to Antonio Gramsci, the communist, who was obviously a Marxist and a communist and was put in jail during the war. Mussolini put him in jail. But when in jail, he wrote the prison notebooks. And what Gramsci argues is that Marxism must become the new religion. And there are many elements in Marxism, cultural Marxism, as it's now called, which are really religious in their character. And Gramsci argued that you had to destroy Christianity, you had to abolish Christianity from Western civilization if Marxism was to take priority, to become prevalent. So when I was doing the postgrad, I became aware of this battle between cultural Marxism, as it's known now, and Christianity. And Pope Benedict, when he was Cardinal Ratzinger, wrote a lot about this. And so I think it's time, to answer your question, for good Christians to fight back and to argue the case. Now, Greg Sheridan has done that. Archbishop Fisher in Sydney is very vocal. Obviously, Cardinal Pell, all of his life, has argued the case for Christian values and beliefs. So I think it's very timely that we have this debate, given what's happening in Australia in areas like political freedom, the federal legislation, the moves in Victoria, for example, to take religious or Christian education out of the curriculum. So there are lots of issues here, and it's time to stand up and argue the case for what we believe in.
Well, Kevin, there's an enormous amount in what you've just said. You've just taken us on a broad sweep of probably about 1,000 years of our history back to the Christian foundings of our universities. And then fast forward to the 20th century, you mentioned Gramsci and the Frankfurt School and how we got to this battle. I've heard you say that the real fight today is between communism and Christianity. Now, you mentioned cultural Marxism. I guess it's more the philosophical underpinning of communism, which is Marxism, which is now at war insidiously today. But most of our audience and most of our fellow citizens don't realise that this battle is even going on. How do you help awaken people to this battle of ideas with these obscure people like Gramsci, who no one's ever heard of, but how that's impacting on our lives today and causing this great pressure to come upon all of us who are Christians and who are wanting to be Christians in the public square?
When I did the postgrad, I mentioned many years ago, it was a doctorate in education curriculum. And I realised that it took 4 or 5 years to do and research and write. It disappeared into the library, and I think there are 3 or 4 copies probably been read by 5 or 10 people over the last 20 years. But I began to understand, and I was fortunate enough to meet Bob Santamaria, God bless him, before he died. And Bob, or BA as people called him, always said to me, "You must fight for what you believe in. You must step forward in the public square. You must organise. You must be an advocate." The left, or the cultural left, they're very effective in working out medium to long term strategies. And you mentioned the Long March, which in a way Gramsci talked about, but really it was Rudi Dutschke, the German, and I can't pronounce his name, but Rudi, during the Cultural Revolution of the late 60s, used the expression. And the argument there is that from the cultural left, they were never going to win the war in the West in terms of communism. The workers would never storm the barricades as they did in Russia. There would never be a revolution as there was with Mao in China. What the cultural Marxists understood, and you mentioned the Frankfurt School in Germany during the 1930s, was that the left would have to take over the institutions, whether it's church, family, the media, political parties, trade unions. The Long March would take many, many years, but the end goal was to abolish Christianity and to impose this radical secular state. And we see that in Victoria with only the last 2 or 3 years, what's happened with Daniel Andrews and the draconian laws undermining people's freedoms. So after doing the doctorate, I realised if I was going to be effective, I would have to get into the public square, as you have and others, and as Greg Sheridan is doing, as Archbishop Fisher, as I mentioned, many others. So I write a lot for the Daily Telegraph, the Herald Sun, the Australian. I do a fair bit of Sky News, trying to reach out to people, to use that expression, about what the current debates are and why we need to be aware of this, what John Howard called the battle of ideas. Because, and I've been reading Christopher Dawson, he makes the point that Christianity and freedom, it's like the air we breathe. Once it's gone, it's too late. So we can't take it for granted. And we see that with issues like Israel Folau being ostracized, losing his career because of simply stating a fact from the Bible about his beliefs. We saw it with Archbishop Porteous in Tasmania being taken before the commission there. There are many, many more examples we don't hear about of ordinary men and women, Christian men and women, who don't get promoted, who aren't comfortable at work, who lose their position because of their beliefs. So, really, it is time, I think, as I mentioned before, to gird our loins, as they say, and to fight the good fight.
Now, it's really important. And one of the reasons I'm so keen to talk to you is to help people understand that there is a war going on, and it is a war. It's a battle for ideas. Thankfully, it's not a shooting war. Let's hope it doesn't come to that. But we now live in a society where, as you mentioned, someone like Israel Folau can lose his job for quoting the Bible. The Bible, not so long ago, was revered by all our forebears. It was a foundation stone for living, a guidebook for life. I've heard you say that the King James Bible had a profound effect on the development of Australia. Could you help our audience understand what you mean by that?
When you look at the arrival of the First Fleet, and obviously it's very topical given Australia Day, but when you look at the arrival of the First Fleet and David Kemp, the ex-Liberal education minister and politician, he's written a number of books now about liberalism and its impact on Australia. When you look at the First Fleet, two of the books that arrived with the convicts, one was the King James version of the Bible, the other was Blackstone's Laws of England. Now, it's only because of that, what we inherited as a nation from the United Kingdom, from Europe, in terms of Christianity, the Bible, and the common law system, which in many ways, as it developed in England, starting with Magna Carta and the Glorious Revolution, that political and legal system that we've inherited is underpinned and informed by Christianity. So when people say to me, we must change the date, I say, no way. One of the reasons we're such a relatively peaceful, stable, prosperous Western liberal democracy is because we inherited the King James Bible and Blackstone's Laws of England, which underpin our way of life. And geographically, we're part of Asia. I mean, we all travel. And many times before COVID, I used to go to what I call Indochina, Cambodia, Vietnam, Laos. They're dictatorships, they're totalitarian regimes like China. What we have to understand in Australia is this battle of ideas, it has very serious consequences because if you look around the world, billions of people live in poverty, in starvation, imprisonment, under dictatorial governments. We have a very precious commodity, our liberties and our freedoms, but that comes from the word of Christ, and in particular the New Testament, and the belief, whether it's the Ten Commandments from the Old Testament or new uh, expressions like love thy neighbor, we have to understand that that underpinning is under threat and that it is a battle which is unforgiving in a sense. That when you look at, for example, what's happening with or what happened with the gender fluidity program, Safe Schools, went into schools around Australia, it's still here in Victoria. When you look at that program to teach primary, kindergarten, young 8, 10-year-old children that gender, sexuality are fluid, dynamic, be whatever you want to be, as long as you self identify, totally contradictory to what the Bible tells us about Adam and Eve and about man and woman, then we have to understand the battle is a very serious one. And as I say, that's why I write for the popular media. And that's why the King James Bible and Blackstone's laws, which, when you look at what's happening in university and our national curriculum, there's never any mention of that. It's more about Aboriginal culture, Aboriginal spirituality, which is bizarre. As I wrote last week in the Daily Telegraph, 54%, 54% of Aborigines identify as Christian.
Yeah.
Less than 2% identify with traditional Aboriginal beliefs and customs. So we are inherently a Christian nation.
That's right, Kevin. And the alarming thing, and this goes to your point about the long march and cultural Marxism, the alarming thing is that most likely, most people my age and younger, and I'll give away I'm early 50s, but most people my age and younger wouldn't have a clue what Blackstone's laws are, probably don't know what the Magna Carta is, and certainly don't know that the King James Bible was fundamental to the development of our laws and underpins the freedoms that we all enjoy now. And I guess we don't know this, but the cultural left knows this, and that's why they're attacking Christianity so severely. If we could turn to the Morrison's government's religious discrimination bill, and you've mentioned the situation in Victoria, part of that bill, as anemic as it is designed to override provisions in Victorian law, which actually criminalise parents from talking to their children about this issue of gender fluidity that you just raised. Again, this goes to the seriousness of the cultural moment that we find ourselves in, doesn't it?
It does. And one of the basic tenets of Christianity in the Bible is that parents are their children's primary educators. Parents are responsible as moral guardians for their children. And when you look at the international covenants and agreements that Australia has signed up to, that is all accepted and endorsed. Parents are primarily responsible for the moral and ethical development of their children. And that's why when you have compulsory schooling, when you have children being made to go to school, primary up until year 10, say, we have to be very careful about what a secular government, in Victoria in particular, which is very radically secular, what that is imposing in terms of its ideology. Now, it's quite well, it's significantly Camille Paglia, the American feminist, who's a radical feminist, calls it child abuse, and she's totally against transgenderism. Many radical feminists like Germaine Greer are as well. But when you get to this fundamental aspect of human identity and a biological fact that we are born as boys or girls, we grow into men or women. When you look at the state starting to teach young kids that that's dynamic, it's fluid, you can be LGBTQI plus. There's a plus because they never know how much more it's going to expand. When you have the government doing that and the Victorian government legislating to make it illegal for parents to counsel their children for whether it's Jewish or Christian or Islamic, parents to pray for their children, they've made that illegal. And that's the evil nature of what we're now having to fight.
It is evil, Kevin, and as you've pointed out, they are teaching our children a different religion. This is not sort of objective secularism. It's not neutral. It's a new religion that's replacing it. You've mentioned a couple of times the great B.A. Santa Maria, who was fighting the cultural battles against communism back from the 50s through to the 80s. I've heard you say, and I've heard others say this, that he always asked the question, what's to be done? And in the launch of your book late last year, which is available on YouTube, it was an online launch, Cardinal Pell, who launched your book, a great hero of the faith and of the culture wars, he offered the advice that we should find allies and get together and get cracking. I think that's great advice. And I'd also add, read your book, because we've got to understand these issues, and you've provided that in simple forms. But what else would you add to the what's to be done in this mad moment that we're currently going through?
Well, we have to be aware of what the issues are and what the battle is. And as you say, one reason I've been writing so much over the last 10, 20 years is because I want to get these debates and arguments into the public domain. You won't get them on the ABC or in the Age or the Sydney Morning Herald. And that's what part of the problem is, that there is so much censorship now in terms of the debate. But we need to be aware of the issues. And B.A. Santa Maria, I think he took the quote from Lenin, "What's to be done," because that is basic to communism. They're always looking for a strategy to further their cause and to argue their case. So we need to do the same thing. Part of that is to be active in the public square. The other is to join groups like you were head of the Australian Christian Lobby for many years, I believe. We have to support politicians of like mind. We have to be active in terms of our local communities, whether it's school, whether it's our friends talking around the dinner table or around a barbecue. We need to be proud of what we are and what we believe in. And I know that's difficult, especially where I live, in the affluent sort of suburbs of Melbourne, where a lot of the baby boomers my age have taken the Kool-Aid, as they say, and are now very cultural left. It's almost become fashionable now to be very cultural left, to accept cultural diversity, to accept relativism, to argue there are no values, there are no beliefs. You can't tell me what to do because it's all subjective. And I mentioned Cardinal Ratzinger, later Pope Benedict. He wrote about this again and again. And this is again the evil nature of what we're approaching. Because as C.S. Lewis wrote in the Screw Tape Letters, once the devil is no longer the evil person with the tail and the pitchfork, once the devil is the person next to you on the train or the person at work who appears moderate and considerate and talks what appears to be common sense, but in fact, it's a mask, a guise for what is fundamentally a very dangerous proposition that there are no absolutes, that everything is relative, everything is subjective, because once we lose that moral grounding in Christian faith, then we have nothing to hold on to. And I was just rereading T.S. Eliot. One of the things he said, and very true, all those years ago, is that once a culture loses religion, it's in danger of disappearing. And Western culture is based on Christianity. And the danger we're facing, and I'm still optimistic, by the way, the danger we're facing is that we're losing that underpinning.
Kevin, that's extremely well said. Sadly, we're going to have to leave it there. We could chat all day on this. There's so much in what you've said. Thank you so much for being so engaged for so many years in decades in helping raise awareness of these issues. The book is Christianity is Good for You. Christianity is Good, Why Faith Matters. It's available at kevindonnelly.com.au. Is that right, Kevin?
Yeah, just one word, kevindonnelly.com.au.
kevindonnelly.com.au. I'd encourage you, the first thing that's to be done is to read Kevin's book and to stay optimistic, to be encouraged. The truth is on our side, and we are certainly in the battle for the soul of our civilization. Kevin Donnelly, thank you so much for...
Thank you very much, Lyle. My pleasure.